Do you experience any sort of intense symptoms after you eat food, such as skin itching or extreme stomach discomfort, sneezing, irritability, anxiety, trouble sleeping? If so, these symptoms could be related to something that has gone undiagnosed for you. It could be a food allergy, food sensitivity, or an intolerance such as a histamine intolerance. I'm going to be exploring this subject a little in depth today thanks to this book called Is Food Making You Sick? This is part of a series called Healthy, Balanced Vegan Body. My name is Whitney. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time watching this channel, and if you have been watching every week, I do these videos every single Wednesday here on this channel exploring a new book. Many of the videos in this series have been centered around weight loss or balancing your body in terms of weight, but this series is really meant to address all sorts of different aspects of our health and getting our bodies into balance so we feel most comfortable in our skin inwardly and outwardly. And one thing that has been a huge part of my personal journey with feeling my best is figuring out my reactions to specific foods. I went vegan about, 12 years ago in 2003, and I immediately felt really great. I thought, wow, this is like the answer to all the things that I'd been struggling with up until then, because before I went vegan, I had so many body issues. I had a bit of an eating disorder for a little while. I felt so out of control with my body. I didn't feel good. I always suspected that I was lactose intolerant, but I don't think I ever was tested for that. And it just naturally felt right for me to do the plant-based diet and become a vegan. And shortly after that, a few years later, I started to experience some other symptoms. In fact, actually, it was probably less than a few years. It might have been within that first year of going vegan. I moved cross country from Massachusetts to Los Angeles, and I started feeling sick. I had a ton of sneezing, and I thought that I had allergies, or I thought that I had a cold or something, and I went to a ton of doctors. I had a few tests done, but most doctors was just having conversations. Nobody really knew what to say about it. They assured me that it was not to do with my change in diet in terms of going plant-based, and I really started to think about the types of food that I was eating and was really having trouble figuring out what was going on. I had a lot of discomfort in my body, such as bloating, a ton of sneezing, I had headaches, I had inflammation, I had all these different issues, and no doctors could help me figure it out. So for years I suffered. I tried all of these different allergy medications. I just assumed I had allergies. People thought that I was sick all of the time. It was embarrassing and it was incredibly uncomfortable. It made it hard for me to work, and it just took so much time for me to finally start to get some clues into what was going on. It took some conversations with people. It took some just experimenting with different natural remedies. And it also took me losing my health insurance when I left one of my stable jobs, because I no longer had access to the expensive medication that I was taking that was, making it easier for me to make it through those symptoms. So I was kind of forced in to try something less expensive and more natural. And I've talked a lot about this in videos. I will link to some of them down below. I want to get to the point of this book, but also wanted to share a bit of my backstory and how much of an impact this has made for me. This has been an ongoing process, so I've really been trying to figure out these symptoms for the past 10 years. And one day, somebody asked me if I thought I might have a reaction to histamines and if I should try the low histamine diet. I had never heard about this, and I wouldn't be surprised if you've never heard about this either, which is why I'm so excited to talk about this today, because if you've struggled with any of those symptoms or a host of other symptoms, which I'll read to you in a moment, this might be something that can really help you out. I think it is super important to figure out how we react to specific foods, because a lot of times we attribute our physical reaction to things, to environmental issues. Like, so many people think that they have seasonal allergies, and that might not necessarily be the case. We might think that we're allergic to some specific materials and substances, and that can certainly be the case, but that might not be the only issue. In fact, a lot of the research that I've done ties food into most of the physical reactions that we have, and I will be covering this again in another book upcoming called The 7-Day Allergy Makeover, which is phenomenal. But today we're going to focus in on this one, which is all about the low histamine diet. I discovered this book through just digging through tons of different websites, and sadly there isn't a ton of information about the low histamine diet out there, so it's taken a lot of time, but I feel like this is an up and coming diet. Now, this diet, this lifestyle, isn't based around being vegan or plant-based, but it is very easy to adapt this to the vegan lifestyle. In fact, when I reached out to the people behind this book, they were super supportive of the plant-based diet, so that's always a good sign with me there. So I'm going to share with you some notes that I've taken about this book. If you do not have time to watch this entire video, you can sign up for the newsletter right down below, and I will email you the PDF notes that I've taken from this so that you can read them yourself before you decide if you want to read this book or not. I will also link to some different resources that I've found online if you want to start digging into this low histamine, and I would love to hear from you too in the comment section, so please chime in as you're watching this video and or after you've completed this. So let's get right into what this book is all about in this low histamine diet. First, I want to begin with some of the symptoms. So people that have reactions to histamine have all sorts of different things that I want you to start to think about if you've experienced them yourself. So as I mentioned at the beginning, it could be skin related. So it could be hives, eczema, itching, skin rashes, psoriasis, inflammation, skin sensitivity, acne like your pimples, or extreme reactions to insect stings. Does any of that ring a bell? For me personally, I have a lot of skin itches, rashes, hives from time to time. Inflammation has been a huge thing for me. Then for your stomach, it could be nausea, vomiting, heartburn, acid reflux, stomach pain, and food sensitivities. A lot of those I've suffered through the years. Bowel, diarrhea, flatulence, chronic constipation, or irritable bowel syndrome, IBS as that's commonly referred to. Head and face, asthma, hay fever, runny nose and weepy eyes, headache similar to a migraine, flushing of face and or chest, or edema, is that how you pronounce it? Edema? I don't know. It's swelling around your eyes and your lips, sometimes the area of your throat. And lastly, a kind of miscellaneous category of symptoms could be anxiety, joint pain, irritability, fuzzy thinking, sleep disorders, fits of dizziness, extreme tiredness, severe period pains for women, sudden drop in blood pressure or cardiac, another word I can't really pronounce, arrhythmia, such as fast beating or irregular heartbeat. So that's a lot of symptoms there, and of course those symptoms can be attributed to a ton of different things. But for me, what kind of started to click was that I have a lot of these symptoms, and I have experimented with the low histamine diet, and in doing so, a lot of those symptoms disappeared. And so through reading this book and the other resources, I really feel like a low histamine diet benefits me greatly. Although I do want to preface this that I have not talked to a doctor yet, and they do say in the very beginning of this book that it's always important to speak to a professional about this beyond doing some self-diagnosis. So before you get too excited, make sure that you take this into account and then bring this to somebody else that can advise you on this personally. So let's dive into some of my book notes from this book and give you a little overview of what you can expect to read. And if you feel inspired, I'm telling you, this book is so great. It's also packed with recipes to help guide you along the way. Okay, so people all over the world suffer from histamine intolerance without being aware of it. Myself included, as far as I can tell. It can be difficult to diagnose. It is a good idea to seek medical advice, take allergy tests, and be screened for other pathological diseases. So what is low histamine? We're going to get into some more details of that, but the strictly low histamine diet omits all foods recognized as containing high levels of histamine, which we'll talk about in a moment, containing chemicals that may boost the release of histamine in the body or inhibit histamine breakdown. It includes foods rich in the nutrients our bodies require to combat histamine intolerance. They recommend that you follow this diet for a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks to see if there's any improvement in your health. As you progress and your symptoms fade, you can begin to add some foods back into your diet one by one, which is really neat. It's also good to know that histamine intolerance can be temporary. It is a condition that develops over time rather than something that we sustain from birth, which is really interesting to me. Furthermore, it seems that histamine intolerance can be short-lived in some people, which signifies that it can be quote-unquote cured. So this is also really exciting. A lot of us think that we're going to be stuck with these symptoms for the rest of our lives, and through changing your diet and lifestyle, you could actually reduce the symptoms greatly long-term or cure yourself. So it's nice to know that you're not stuck with something. I think a lot of people just think that they're going to experience something for the rest of their lives, and they do things that kind of mask those symptoms but don't get to the root of the problem. And really a huge key in everything that I do in terms of my own personal experience and the research that I share with you is getting down to the root. So let's talk about histamine. It's probably something that you've heard about before. You know, antihistamines, we think about that. We think of seasonal allergies. We think of reactions to things like insect stings. But let's get a little bit more clear about this. And this is a very brief summary again. The book, it goes much more in depth about this, of course. So histamine occurs naturally in all plants and animals and is actually vital for our good health. Histamine helps to regulate bioactivities such as digestion, sleep, blood pressure, sexual function, and the operations of the brain. When foreign irritants such as pollen, certain foods, pollution, and mosquito saliva invade our tissues, our immune system responds. Part of this response involves releasing histamines from storage. Histamine can be manufactured inside of our bodies. It can also enter our system via histamine-rich foods. In most people, histamine molecules have a short life. They are broken down by two enzymes, HMT and DAO. That is the abbreviation for them because they're longer words that I don't feel like saying right now. Some people don't produce enough HMT or DAO to properly control their histamine levels. If the enzyme is not working properly or if there's not enough of it available, the histamine remains intact and starts to accumulate. This initiates increased inflammation and a wide range of other symptoms, which is exactly what we're talking about here with histamine intolerance. So to think about this in a way that might make sense for you is that thinking of it kind of like a cup. So they say the tide in our histamine cup rises and falls, only causing symptoms after it overflows. You can think of histamine like a liquid, right? If it gets too full and it starts to overflow, that's where the symptoms happen. When a person's histamine intakes exceeds their own tolerance limits, which is going to differ from person to person, they begin to experience some of the symptoms that I've talked about. These symptoms appear similar to food allergy and food sensitivities, which is something that I thought I was facing for so long, but I actually had food allergy tests done and doctors told me I didn't have food allergies. So that's part of why it took me so long to find something like histamine intolerance, is that I was pushed in the wrong direction. Histamine intolerance differs from food allergies or sensitivities because the reaction depends on that cumulative dose and is not immediate. Histamine intolerance is not a true allergy and therefore it does not show up on allergy tests, which is why it probably wouldn't have shown up on mine. Again, I don't know for sure about histamine intolerance for myself, but based on the research, I'm making that temporary conclusion until I see a doctor. And again, you always got to be super careful about self-diagnosis here. The only real test for histamine intolerance necessitates a histamine-free diet succeeded by a double-blind food challenge. So I have done the low histamine diet for extended periods of time. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, but I've never done the double-blind food challenge, which would mean that I would have to introduce some foods with, it's a little complicated, they talk about it in the book, but basically somebody else would have to initiate some sort of food challenge for me, and I'd have to see if I reacted to it. I would like to do that at some point. So I guess basically they're saying that you can't really test for it necessarily, which is probably why no doctor has ever really brought it up. But I also think it's just not talked about that much yet. It's kind of like this more underground thing, but if you are starting to feel like you might have a histamine intolerance, then you're probably going to start to see a lot of puzzle pieces falling into place. So, disorders related to histamine tolerance. This is really interesting. So listen to some of these lists here, and if you're suffering from any of this, it is possible that histamine intolerance could be causing them or exacerbating these issues that you're having. So acid reflux, heartburn, eczema, fibromyalgia, hemorrhoids, inflammation, inflammatory bowel disease, migraines, obesity, heart disease, diabetes, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, psoriasis, sleep disorders, and motion sickness. What's also interesting is nearly all eczema patients test positive for allergies. So this is fascinating because I know firsthand, like with my father, for example, he has suffered with psoriasis for so long, and he treats it, I think, with creams and pills. He has never tried to get to the root of his psoriasis through his diet, at least not that I've known, but so many of these issues are related to the foods that we're eating. They are not necessarily going to be solved by taking medications, by putting things on our body, by, all these different treatments that we go through. That is possibly masking the symptoms here. What's also interesting for me personally is that I've either suffered from a number of these things myself or family members of mine have. So it's important to think about your whole history here. Like, are there other people in your family that have any of those or some of the things that they go into greater detail in this book? And is it possible that you might be biologically susceptible to this? It's an interesting thing to consider. So low histamine nutrition includes or involves consuming whole unprocessed foods that are rich in vitamins B and C, copper, zinc, calcium, and magnesium. This book goes into great depth about which foods you can get each of those nutrients from, which I think is super important to understand. They recommend that you steer clear of foods rich in histamine, histamine liberators, DAO blockers, and vitamin depleters. They recommend that you avoid fermented foods, excessive sugar, and saturated fat. And again, great detail in this book about which foods should be avoided. And I will say that there is a long list of things that should be avoided, and I'll talk about some of my personal experiences with that in a moment. Another interesting tip from this is they recommend preparing your food immediately prior to eating it. Do not consume leftovers or any dishes prepared on the previous day unless they have been frozen on the interim, because that can actually cause histamine levels to rise. So histamine isn't necessarily related just to foods, it's also related to how long the food has been sitting out. And in this book, they do not recommend eating any meat for that very reason, because of things like bacteria. So that's something that will definitely require some change in the way that you eat if you do typically eat a lot of leftovers. But if you don't really like leftovers, then I guess you're in luck. This makes things really easy. On that same note, they suggest growing your own herbs, fruits, and vegetables in a home garden. But if you don't have that, or you don't want to have that, you could just grow your own potted herbs like basil, mint, and parsley on your windowsill, on your balcony, so that will give you the freshest experience possible. So really starting to think about where your food is coming from, which quick little tip will not only help you out if you do suffer from a histamine intolerance, but it's just cheaper, it's fresher, and you get to know exactly where your food is coming from, which makes you feel that much more connected to it. So I think those are good tips in general. There's a lot of good little nuggets of information in this book about the way foods interact with our bodies, and one great section that I think you might find of interest, even if you don't have a histamine intolerance. I don't know if you're still watching in that case, but I'm going to say this anyways. Omega-3s are believed to decrease allergic responses through anti-inflammatory activity. Research shows that these fatty acids reduce inflammation and may help lower risk of chronic disease such as heart disease, cancer, and arthritis. So super important to get your omega-3s. They talk a lot about getting it through flax in this book. Omega-6 fatty acids play a pivotal part in the operation of the brain and in the body's growth and development. They aid in the stimulation of skin and hair growth, they keep our bones healthy, control metabolism, and keep the reproductive system in good condition. So super important to get those essential fatty acids in your diet. They really emphasize that nutrition from real food is generally better, balanced, and absorbed than nutrition from man-made supplements. So this book is very, very focused on the food aspects of that, which is something that comes into play in all the different books that I've been reading as part of this Healthy, Balanced Vegan Body series. They say that instead of relying on medications to allay our unpleasant signs of histamine intolerance, we can reduce our histamine load in a number of ways so that our histamine cup never again overflows and we can enjoy life symptom-free. So not only do they talk about food in this book, but they also recommend being less stressed out, reducing environmental factors. So again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people can be triggered allergically or sensitivity to all sorts of different things in your environment. That's something I'm going to go into greater detail when I cover the 7-Day Allergy Makeover book, which has some awesome tips in it. This is fascinating, and I kind of wish I had mentioned this earlier because so many people might not feel like they're connected to the low histamine lifestyle, but they might take antihistamines for a variety of different things. In the book, they say that antihistamines do not act directly against histamine, but they can temporarily block certain effects of histamine. Antihistamines do not treat the cause of the symptoms. In fact, long-term use of these drugs is linked to weight gain. So if you find yourself taking antihistamines on a regular basis, maybe you just start to sneeze, maybe you're not feeling well, maybe whatever it is, you're just used to it, as many of us are, this could actually cause some long-term issues, and this could be related to any sort of lingering weight gain or excessive weight gain that's been happening to you for no apparent reason. Similarly, corticosteroids such as inhalers, nasal sprays, topical creams, these are typically used because they imitate the activities of the hormones produced naturally in the body, but they have potential side effects of short-term usage that include high blood pressure, fluid retention, and weight gain as well. So a lot of the things that people typically use to get rid of any symptoms that seem to have are as a result of like an allergic reaction or sensitivity, antihistamines and these various steroids can be causing issues. And I have taken so many of these in my day, and honestly, through changing my diet, through changing all of these different tweaks in my lifestyle, I've been able to actually feel better than I did by taking any of those medications. So that's hope for you if you've been trying a lot of different things out yourself. Lastly, vitamin B12 is depleted when we take antihistamine drugs for prolonged periods. So B12 comes up so much in all of these books. Anything when you're talking about vegan nutrition, plant-based nutrition, B12 comes up. This is the one thing that we can't get from the plant-based diet, so most people have to supplement with it. That's recommended by pretty much every doctor. But how frustrating to hear that even if you're supplementing with it, it might be depleted because you're taking antihistamines. Two last things to share with you here. Encouraging evidence shows that probiotics are able to mitigate allergic disorders, and some alternative medicine practitioners recommend that bromelain be taken as an alternative to antihistamines in conjunction with vitamin C and I think it's pronounced quercetin. I don't know. I'm so bad at pronouncing things. But again, these things are covered in here. But simple, natural supplements or additions to your diet or things that are part of other foods can really, really help you out, and you won't need to take those antihistamines. I love this note that they make right before the recipe section here. They say, if you are, like most people, capable of digesting gluten without any problems, gluten-containing foods are good for you. They are highly nutritious, packed with vitamins, minerals, and beneficial fibers. Gluten is only a problem for people who have been diagnosed with celiac disease or who are non-celiac gluten sensitive. In these people, gluten can lead to leaky gut syndrome. So many people ask about gluten-free that I'm personally on a gluten-free diet almost all the time. I do not have celiac disease, at least I don't think so. I certainly don't have any of the symptoms, but I've never been tested for it. I do identify as somebody who is gluten sensitive. I feel so much better when I don't eat gluten, and I don't usually feel good when I eat gluten. The only times that I eat gluten is when it's a rare treat, but I keep it super limited. However, I think this is an important thing to bring up because a lot of people just assume that gluten is bad for you, and in fact, if you don't seem to react to it, there's no reason to cut it out. So this book is not strictly gluten-free. It is a very strict book. They remove a lot of foods, but they want to emphasize that you do not have to take gluten out of your diet. It's not necessarily connected to histamine reactions. So because of time, I'm not going to go into any further detail here, but I will tell you that the strictly low histamine diet is very strict. That's a great name for it. I've tried this out. I felt a lot better, but it's hard for me personally to stick to because it is pretty extreme. I mean, they're cutting out things like all citrus and tomatoes and just so many different things in here that I was like, I don't know how to eat without them. And the recipes are really great. However, a lot of the recipes here are, well, actually, I would say most of the recipes are vegan and are easily veganized. For me, though, I do have some sensitivities to things that they recommend in here, so I found myself having to adapt it. So I would say this is really great to try out. I would recommend trying it for 4 to 6 weeks and just kind of pushing through it. Make your shopping list, use the recipes, get creative. Go online. Again, I have some links down below if you want to check out some other websites. There's a few other people that talk about this. I've had trouble finding a lot of vegans talking about low histamine, so if you're out there, and you have some further resources, please leave them in the comments below so we can continue passing things on. And while you're there, if you have any personal experience with this or a similar diet, maybe FODMAPs, that's another very similar to the low histamine diet. Anything you want to talk about here, any advice that you have to give, please let me know because I could benefit from it and I bet a lot of other people can. So I absolutely recommend this book if you've been experiencing any of those symptoms or someone else you know. This book could be a great, great gift. You never know whose life you're going to change. But I also recommend this if you're just simply curious about all these different elements of healing yourself naturally through your diet. I think this book could be a great addition to your bookshelf. And like I said, some good recipes in here. Let me see if I can give you a good example. Like candied sweet potatoes, and super simple. Because the low histamine diet is so strict, most of these recipes don't have a ton of ingredients, which means that they do not take a long time to create, and they are not very expensive. There's a ton of desserts in here. There's all sorts of, there's a lot of desserts in here. Breads and cookies and side dishes and main courses like rice pilaf and pastas and stir fries. I mean, there really is a great variety in here. I think even just following these recipes can help you transition over to more of a whole foods diet and eat less processed foods and just eating as freshly as possible. It could benefit a lot of people. If you have happened to read this book, it's kind of on the obscure side, but if you have read it, please let me know too in a comment any of your personal experiences. Thank you so much for watching. Again, you can sign up right down below if you want to get the notes for yourself or to pass on to somebody else. I've also linked to this book so you can purchase it. To give you a heads up on what's coming up next time, let me take a look. I had put out a list for people to vote when I first started this series, and that's what I follow to figure out what I'm eating each week. And I apologize because I haven't really been keeping you posted on this. Let's see. Where's my list? Computer's running a little bit slow here. Okay, the next book, is the 22-Day Revolution, which is actually perfect in time for the new year starting up. So if you want to follow along, you check out that book. I've linked to it down below. If you haven't watched the other videos in this series, please do, because there's lots of great information. Again, I will email you once a week with whatever books that I'm covering and with the videos so you don't miss them. The link is down below. I've also linked to some other videos where I've talked about the low histamine diet if you want to explore that a little bit further, as well as being gluten-free and my whole journey figuring out the root of my own food sensitivities. Thank you so much for watching. I can't wait to hear from you in the comment section. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if this is your first time watching this video, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. I will see you next Wednesday for another episode of The Healthy, Balanced Vegan Body. Thanks again for watching.